we were using for the refraction and the refraction amount, and the reflection glossiness. But I'm just going to incorporate a custom texture that I'm providing with these scene files just to introduce a little bit more chaos and randomness to that outer surface, because you can see here it's looking pretty smooth and clean. So in the reflection glossiness slot, I'm just going to load the bitmap, and I'm going to use the foggy ice reflection map I've got here. I'm going to check make visible, and then we can see the size of it in the viewport. Just adjust it to what's similar to your reference image, and you can see here, I've just winged it just to get it as close as possible. And what that will do is it will introduce just a bit of roughness into the reflection slot, and it won't be so perfect. I'm just going to add a color correction on that and just introduce a little bit more contrast. And that's a bit better. Alright, so now I'll just do a re-render basically, and just have to wait all over again. And one thing I forgot to do, which sometimes happens, is I forgot to change the subdivs on the glossiness. So I'm just going to raise that to 32. So it's been rendering for a couple of minutes now, and I just wanted to take a couple of seconds to explain to you that once again I've got bloom and glare enabled, and you can see the settings here. They'll be in the scene files also, but you can see the intensity mask I've got them set to really captures the like a nice gradient from dark to bright on the ice itself. So in the brightest parts, what's going to happen is we're going to get a little bit of bloom and glare popping just to give these highlights a little bit of extra glow. And if we go into the reference here, you'll see it's doing the same exact thing, except it's actually gone a little bit purple, and we're getting a little bit of chromatic aberration around the ice itself, which I'm going to introduce into this also. You'll notice I don't like applying a lot of effects to my renders. I kind of just do the absolute bare minimum necessary for a retoucher to take a hold of it. And I know we're still in the middle of the V-Ray course, but I am preparing to work on a retouching course with a friend of mine who I worked at Light Farm, Milton Menendez, and he's one of the best and fastest retouchers in the world. So hopefully the goal is when this course is finished and I move on to doing the lighting course, that ties in with his course where he'll be taking those lit scenes and then retouching them further. So the render's finished and I'm pretty happy with it. There is a couple of things that I've noticed. One of those is that there's quite a lot of little fireflies and noise, and that's simply because if I bring the settings in over here, the color threshold was set to 0.015 instead of 0.01, but that was just to save a little bit of rendering time. As you can see, rendering it at this size here took 50 minutes on my boxes, which isn't that great, and that's even with everything kind of optimized as good as I could get it. So V-Ray just handles refractions a little bit slow, but that being said, we've got a lot of maps in the shader, we've got a lot of samples, and there's a full HDR that has to have important sampled, like important sampling happening, and it's all just very complex. So you have to forgive it a little bit, and like I was saying earlier, some jobs you're just going to need to wait for the renders. I had to do it, and if you don't have a massive render farm, you will too. There's going to be times where you set off renders that just take 12 hours. So let's get this into Photoshop, and we'll do some little adjustments just to making it look a little bit more poppy and a little bit nicer and cleaner. Okay, so in our reference image you can see it's just a little bit brighter, Now if that happens and you've already rendered it, then you're just going to have to make the adjustment in Photoshop. Just remember though that when you do make these adjustment layers, make sure that they're non-destructive so that you're not doing them here, because if I apply that there, I've lost it. Whereas if I put an adjustment layer down here, I can change that at any point in time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring the exposure up just a little, and sometimes you'll see what happens is that things start to blow out. So what I can do is if I just hide this in the layers panel, you see that when we add that, we've got a little mask for it. What I usually like to do is, and I usually would use a tablet for this, but I'm going to use a mouse just to show you that it's possible with a mouse also. I don't want you guys thinking you have to go out and buy a tablet when it's not fully necessary, although it is extremely important. So I'm just going to click the mask there, and I can just paint away the highlight parts so that they're not blowing out so much. Just zoom in. If you hit X, it'll just swap the colors around, then you can just quickly fix that up. Okay, so that's the first part done. The next thing I'm going to do is, and I did explain this in the chocolate lesson, I'm just going to bring this shader over the top, and I'm just going to blur it just a little bit. I'm going to make it a little bit bright. And then once I'm happy with this exposure, I'm just going to duplicate the base layer so that I have the same raw render there as when we started. I'm going to bake the exposure layer down, and now we've got the original and the new one. We've also got this one, and I'm just going to make it 8 bits so that now we can use all the adjustment layers. So you'll notice I'm not putting this on soft light, instead I'm putting it on screen, just because I want to bring out a little bit more brightness into the render. Next I'm going to flatten this. I'm just going to go Control A, Control C to copy the layer, undo the collapsing, paste it on top, and I'm just going to try out what happens when I put a sharpen on this. Okay, cool. Now one last thing I can do here is I can just bring the resolution down a little bit, and hopefully that gets rid of the firefly's strength just enough, but realistically I should re-render this. So there you go. I think that's a pretty damn close result, and even though it's not perfect, that's simply because I don't have the same texture available that was, which is being created here. You could always try and make this a texture and use it later. For example, sometimes I might try just cropping an area, making it grayscale, and just seeing what kind of information I can get out of this map. And now you can see I've gotten quite a few cool streaks and things like that I can use. Say for example, if I have another map here, I can bring this in and possibly multiply it in and set it lower intensity, and just I get these kind of things affecting the scene. But that's a bit of a stretch. Some textures will be much better suited than others for doing that, but with refractive materials it becomes a bit harder. So now we can move on to the next part of the lesson, which is going to be describing how to add in more detailed refractions. And I'm going to show you the different methods that you can use to simulate that fog inside the surface. For this shader we've gone a little bit more subtle, but in the next one we're going to try and get actual really visible geometric fog inside the surface. So like I was saying, there's a few different ways in which we can create different effects on the inner surface of the ice. One of those is by creating a duplicate version of the outer geometry and shrinking it so that it's kind of distorted and on the inside of the mesh. Another method is by creating like a tube of geometry in which you can scatter fur on. And an extension of that is if you also have forest pack, you can scatter icicles and things like that on the inside of the shader. Another thing we can do is use the V-Ray environment fog to create a very realistic interior, but at the cost of an insane render time. So I'm yet to do any major high-res testing with V-Ray environment fog on the inside just because of the render speeds. But basically, V-Ray fur kind of behaves similar and gives a faster result. For this though, what we'd have is we have the outside ice cube, which is very similar to the ice cube in the first scene, and a very similar shader also, but this ice cube has a very distorted piece of geometry on the inside, which you can see here is just an optimized version of the outer surface. It's got a UVW modifier applied to it so that the texture is visible, and we've got a V-Ray light material applied. So the most important thing about this scene setup, and I don't need to, now that I've already gone through how to set up the ice shader itself, basically it's just about knowing the method for getting the inner part to look correct and to refract correctly. So we've got a couple of different things to consider here. One is the shader used on the inside material. Now what I use is, and what I've found to give the most realistic results and the easiest to manage results, is by doing this method where I do duplicate the inner geometry and apply a shader to it. So the shader we're going to use is V-Ray light material. The color is going to be 255 white. We're going to set to emit light on backside because otherwise it's going to be black on the opposite side, which we're going to see through because we've got a texture map applied into the opacity slot. We've also got multiply color by opacity. That's just going to give you the transparent appearance like you can see there. So inside this composite map, we've got a couple of different procedural textures here. At the base, I've got another interesting procedural map that I've generated, which you can check out. That's just got some varied settings in order to produce this result. One thing you'll need to be aware of is that it's very, very contrasty, and it's kind of maybe a little high res in terms of like how often it goes back and forth. But overall, I just thought it was producing an interesting result. It kind of looked liquidy, and that's why I went with it. So if I just hide these other two layers, on top of that, what we then have is we have a second layer which is just darkening off parts. I don't want the ice showing through so strongly that you can tell it's a texture. I'm trying to kind of keep things a little bit subtle. But then I've gone too far by removing detail, and the next layer is got to kind of bring in a little bit more detail back. So now that just goes over the top. And then lastly, we include an actual bitmap texture, and we blend that through. So if we now render this as is, just with nothing but the inner surface, you'll see how this looks. So there you can see how the surface looks on the inside. And there's a couple of different things I've done just to make it appear a little bit more ice-like. If I was doing something that needed a little bit more detail and it was higher res, I probably wouldn't be this lazy, but I thought there was a pretty good chance that it was going to look like cracks, so I went with it. Now what I'm talking about is the UVW map I've applied. I'm using shrink wrap, and you can see at the base there it's kind of stretching the texture, giving it just some variation and some different length lines at different points, and that should technically come through while you're rendering it. You can see at the base there we've kind of got a different shape happening. So this texture, it's basically comes down to whether or not you want to use procedurals or just a straight up diffuse texture. All I've done to create this texture is taken a image of ice, made it grayscale, and then increase the contrast until it was enough to create the opacity scene. If you want more white parts in the refraction, just go whiter on the map. It's that simple. Okay, so moving on now, we can take a look at how to create the inner fog with V-Ray Fur. So the first thing I'm going to do is I need to put in some geometry on the inside of this surface so that we can scatter the fur onto. So what I find easiest is, and first I'll just get rid of this inner surface. We'll just hide that for now. I can re-enable transparency. And I'm just going to put a cylinder on the inside of the surface. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add enough height segments so that when I add noise to this surface and make it a little bit more random, there's enough detail there to not break the geometry. Alright, next up we can just go into the standard primitives or the creation menu, go down to V-Ray, and if we click V-Ray Fur with that tube selected, it's going to create fur automatically. So I just want to select that tube again, right click it, and set it to be invisible, like non-renderable. Basically that's just going to make it completely invisible to the render in every way, shape and form, which is exactly what we want. So next up with the fur, we can just start playing with some settings, and I'm just going to make the taper value 1 so that at the tips it becomes thicker. I'm going to disable flat normals. I can just add maybe add or reduce depending on what my goal is. I'm just going to add this time, add the different level of knots. I'm going to increase the direction variation and the length variation. I'm also going to decrease the randomization on the thickness and just make that 0.1. Now at this point I just want to see how thick the fur is and see how many hairs there actually are. So I'm going to hide the outside surface and just do a quick render of this. So you can see the hair's just a little bit too thick and there's not enough of it. So I'm going to cancel that. I can just move that out of the way a little bit. I'm going to double the hairs. I'm going to make the thickness just half what it is. And I'm going to decrease the length. And try again. Alright, so at this point I just want to apply my shader that I had set on the inside. I'm just going to increase the number of hairs again. Still, I need to add more. And now we start to get a little bit of a build up there and the appearance of that kind of foggy inner surface. And when you combine that with the refraction glossiness, it ends up looking quite like fog. So once again, I can just go up, maybe check the length, just make it a little bit longer. Can bring the gravity up or down depending on if I want to make kind of streaky shards. So I think at this point we're ready to test and see how that looks on the inside of the surface. And we also need to remember to hide that old inner surface as well. Now there will be a couple of hairs that stick out of the surface, and to fix that, what I like to do is on the geometry, I can just add an edit poly modifier, collapse it, and that's going to give me a new editable poly object to work with. And I can just pull the geometry in a bit until the fur stops going through it. So now from the render view we can see how this is going to look. And I'm just going to cancel that, and I'm just going to make the render time a little bit faster by making it much smaller again. And I can also drop back on the anti-aliasing as well. So as you can see, the result looks pretty cool, but it does require a little bit of modification to this tube, and you do need to figure out where you want the fog to go in order to create the best looking result. It doesn't just magically work straight off the bat. So what I do from this point, knowing that the ice is looking really cool and the V-Ray fur is working in the way I want it to, is I'd probably go in and make it a little bit more uniform throughout the inside of the surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the tube, go to a perspective view, and I'm just going to select half of it and just kind of raise it and scale it up. And I'm going to do the same for the other half as well. And now the fog is going to be a lot more evenly spread throughout the surface. I'm going to select the fur, I'm going to add more of it, maybe a third more. I'm going to increase the bend amount and just add a couple more knots, and we'll see how that goes. I might need to just quickly move it a little bit to get it out of the way of the other parts. But now we can re-render and see how this looks. And this should look a lot better. I'm also going to render it just a bit higher res so you can see how it looks with a little bit more to see. Now I should also note, while this is rendering, this isn't the way I currently do it anymore. I do use Forest Pack. The reason why I'm showing you how to do it with V-Ray Fur is because not everyone will have Forest Pack, and some of you guys would be a little bit disappointed just because you didn't have the plugin that you couldn't create this effect. So I actually did come from using this method and then advance to using Forest Pack, which is what I'll show you in a second. And the reason for that is extra control over the shape of the tubes. But basically, I just didn't have enough control using this method. It was definitely achievable to get the results I wanted, but it was just harder to do it. So we'll start this up again once it's rendered. So the results turned out pretty cool. When I first was figuring out how to do this, I saw a couple of guys also using geometry on the inside of their surfaces and stuff, and I saw a couple of ways in which that was failing, and I thought Fur was going to be the answer for that. But as I started rendering much higher res, it just didn't have the that kind of ice clarity in the fog that I wanted. So it looked cool, and you do have a lot of power using Fur. Don't get me wrong, if you've got a cool retoucher working for you, things like this can easily just be cleaned up and they'll make it look how you need it to. But ultimately I started using Forest Pack to scatter ice on the inside of the surface, and I'll work on that version on part 2 of this lesson because the lesson's just going on so long now. The next thing I want to show though is how you can actually use V-Ray's environment fog on the inside of the surface to also create realistic results. So in order to create the V-Ray environment fog localized just to the inside of the box, we need to go into the environment tab slot and add a V-Ray environment effect. When you create that, it's going to bring up a dialog box which has a whole bunch of controls. Now I will be covering in detail this later, how to use fog to create different effects and things like that. But in this specific lesson, I'll just show you how to set it up specifically for ice. So I'm going to be using this inner object for the fog, and like I did with the V-Ray tube, for the fur, I'm going to make it non-renderable. So the next thing I want to do is just double check that the atmospheric effects are on in the main settings. So in the common tabs, if you ever see that V-Ray environment fog isn't rendering for some random reason and it's enabled and you're changing the settings, it's probably disabled in the options box here. So make sure atmospheric effects is on and then you'll be able to use it. Once you've made sure that the options box are ticked correctly, you need to add the actual geometry you want to use for your fog as a gizmo in the V-Ray environment fog nodes drop down box. So what you need to do is down the bottom left here, just click add, and then you'll be given the choice to select a piece of geometry in the scene. We're going to select this one. I'll just rename that just so it's a bit easier. And we can just re-add that again. Alright, so I'm going to do a render now, and I hope that some fog's going to be visible inside there, but I might need to change the fog distance. So there you can see we've got some fog. If I change the fog distance to be lower, we'll see more fog coming through. It'll be denser. And and just adjust that to what you personally want. I'm going to make the fog distance 5. I'm going to increase the subdivs to 16. And then I'm also going to change the fade out on the actual gizmo itself, so that near the edges you see here that it's fading towards a very clear opacity. We want that to happen much further in, so it looks more like a foggy ball. So I'm just going to change that to 5 and see what effect that has. And now you can see that it's softening off around the edges, giving a more pillowy look and a more foggy look. If I increase that even further, you'll start to see that it renders a bit slower, but has a much more foggy appearance. So now at this point we can see how it looks on the inside of the ice itself. Now I'm just going to cancel this render as it's going, because as you can see it looks pretty terrible, and the reason for that is it appears that when you put V-Ray environment fog inside glossily refracted surfaces, it just goes a bit haywire. Now the reason I let it continue to render is because I wanted to show you that it's actually a pretty cool effect. And if I just cancel this here and duplicate the shader we've got, one thing I could see this being useful for, even though the render times are insane, is if you wanted to create stuff like minerals and materials that have that real subtle, dirty translucency in them, like emerald, for example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the fog color a lot stronger. And when I do that, the end result should end up looking pretty cool. So like I was saying, the result is really cool. And interestingly enough, a lot of the shaders that were kind of released early on were kind of created just by chance in situations similar to this, where I'd be aiming to create one thing and notice something kind of strange going on, think outside the box for a little bit, and then figure out how to make that work for a different material. And there was a couple of jobs where I had to pitch, and I made some really cool emerald and ruby materials similar to this, and this is exactly how I did it. So hopefully, you guys can see the importance of just experimenting around a little bit, and maybe even trying to take what I'm doing to another level, because I'm trying to show you in a way which covers all the detail, but doesn't take me 6 hours of refining over and over like I would on a real job to do. So how do we actually fix this situation? Now, because it's buggy, what I noticed is you have to use a very simple V-Ray material in order to not bug out this fog effect. So all I do is I turn the reflect to 100, the refraction to 100. I'm going to go into the options, and I'm going to make it reflect on the back side, and I'm just going to turn material preview on. And if I assign this shader to the block, then you'll see the fog effect much more clearly. And I'm actually just going to cancel that, and I'm just going to give the environment fog just a little bit of emission. And re-render. So while I've noticed this, I just wanted to point out a problem with V-Ray that might be a little bit frustrating that you might encounter when you're working with these scenes, is that on the last couple of buckets, because we're kind of using V-Ray environment fog in a way that it's not designed for, It can create bucket hangs like we're seeing now, and you can see the render's been going for 42 minutes, but realistically it's been stuck on the last 3 or 4 buckets for about 10 or 15 minutes. And this has happened on all boxes I've worked with throughout my time using V-Ray, and it's just something that happens usually when I'm pushing things to their absolute limits, or where I'm using lots of RAM, lots of high-res geometry, things like that. But I'll wait for this render to finish, and as you can see, the result looks really cool. I've got a reference image up here where we can start to see we're getting a kind of similar effect where you've got fog on the inside, which is its own individual object, and then you've got a very simple ice shader on the outside of that, and when you combine the two it creates a really cool effect. So I'll bring this into Photoshop, and I know it's a low-res render and the render times are crazy, but for the guys out there who sometimes get these job pitches that require very specialized briefs and they physically don't have a way to recreate it, it can be quite stressful, and sometimes the easiest solution is just to wait for a really long render and everyone's happy. So you can see the render's done now. I'll just bring it in Photoshop and do a couple of adjustments on it, and then I'll start to wrap up this first lesson. So once again, I just duplicate the layer, increase the exposure a little bit. Also going to increase the contrast just this time. Going to make the image 8-bit. Put a blur on it. And just play with a couple of modes here. And soft light kind of helps it look a little bit more interesting, less flat, puts more focus on the actual ice block itself. So if we sharpen that as well, the noise doesn't really help it that much, but we're still getting a really cool effect. So I've kind of got through quite a few examples now where we've made some really cool and complex shaders in a variety of ways. And I've still got the Icy Pole shader to show you and the Forest Pack flakes over the top of that, and I'll cover that in the introduction to the second part of this lesson, where it does get a little bit more complicated once again because I'll be utilizing Forest Pack, and we'll also be covering some larger scale scenes that requires some procedural displacement, and we'll also potentially be looking at using the V-Ray Metaballs. So as always, I hope you really enjoyed this lesson, and I know we've still got quite a bit to cover in the snow lesson. It's also going to be probably an hour and 20 long, but I felt like because of the delays and everything, it was kind of time for another really long lesson with a lot of info packed in it, similar to lesson 4 part 1 and 2. And because we're dealing with refractive surfaces for the first time, at least in an obvious way, I thought it would be a good idea to show you kind of the power of that and the different controls at your fingertips when you're working with it, in order to create, really high quality results that clients will sit there and wonder which one's the photo, you know what I mean? If you get it to within 95%, they just have no idea. And if I showed a client this image, they'd just be like, yeah, it's a photo. Maybe to us CG guys, it doesn't look as realistic because we're the ones defining all the values that make it how it looks, and you kind of know what you've done to get there. But when clients see things, they're usually pretty easy to please. If you get 90-95% of the way there, they're not going to kill you over little indiscrepancies in the surface. They just want the job out, done, looking good, and little details sometimes don't need to be added. That being said, if it was my job to recreate this ice block exactly, obviously there's a lot of detail in the model that I didn't spend time working on, and I'd probably figure out I'd probably go and take my own photos of different scratch surfaces in order to create the bump maps and the displacement maps to pump out the surface while working in ZBrush. So the next lesson will probably be out in 1 to 2 weeks time. I've already done a lot of the prep work and all the scene files for that, but there's just so much information to cover, I've got to break it up into 2. Please let me know how you go with these shaders. I love seeing work that you guys submit to emails and on the Facebook page, and it motivates me to keep going because I see you guys getting the benefit from the course. And if I don't really see that, then I kind of get a little bit insecure and think that maybe you guys aren't benefiting from it. But every so often I see something from you guys that's just insane, and it's taken even further than what I've been doing, and it's really awesome to see that, and to see that there are guys out there who weren't doing work like this just a few months ago, and now they're doing some of the best shaders I've ever seen. It's pretty cool. So once again, guys, thanks heaps. Sorry for the delays while I was injured. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. I'll let you guys know when my next fight is, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks heaps. Sorry, I just thought I'd add before finishing up the lesson that the scene files are going to be included, and as I was working through the different scenes, when we change scenes each time, these are the related scenes. So the first scene is the first bit of ice we did, the second is putting the fur in, and the third is putting the environment fog in.